I'm really excited to have Damian Eke here. We've talked a little bit about data ethics and governance and so on, but it's actually really exciting to have, I'd say, the world expert on data sharing in neuroscience specifically. He's thought a lot about the ethical and regulatory issues around that. Speak about that. I think it's becoming increasingly important. It's not something we thought about when we started, say, something like NeuroHackademy, but then I think we all realize how complicated it becomes and how tangled it becomes and how it actually impacts the science. So it's really exciting to have this addressed in a systematic way by someone who, in contrast to me, for example, understands the issue really, really well. So with that, thank you for doing it.
Thank you very much, Ariel. And thanks for having me. I deeply appreciate that introduction. As he said, I'm not a neuroscientist. Let me just be clear about it. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I found myself working in this field within the neuroscience community. Maybe you know more about data than myself, but maybe there are a few things that you can learn from this session about data sharing and data processing. Today, we're going to talk about responsible data governance for neuroscience, the need for fair C. I want this to be an interactive session. After 2 years of hibernating in our different homes and working from our homes, I think we need to make the best of coming together and seeing each other's faces this way. Please, let's make it as interactive as possible. So what do you expect to get today? We're going to talk a little bit about data governance in neuroscience, the meaning of data governance in neuroscience, the nature of it, the rationale for doing it, for actually considering it, the framework, and then we'll talk about fair C. What do we mean by fair C, and how do we do fair C, and the role of research infrastructures in this space. And then if we have time, we can discuss a case study. We'll have time to be in different groups to discuss a case study. But since we're talking about neuroscience data, and you are the neuroscientist, is there anybody that can tell us a little bit more about what is neuroscience data? If we say neuroscience data, what do we mean by that? Anybody? That's very nice. Big range of possibilities. That's the most important thing. I know you have seen this diagram before from Churchland. We know neuroscience data as measurements of anything related to the brain. It can be neuroimaging, MRI, EEG, or name them. But what is very important to note in these times is that the nature of neuroscience data is changing. It's not just about the measurements again, just the measurements that you get from the brain. But now, because of the emerging convergence of neuroscience with other sciences, neuroscience data is changing to include models, to include software, to include metadata. And that's the background to what we're going to talk about today. But also, there is an increasing need to share data across boundaries, across jurisdictional boundaries. It might be because of the funders' requirement. If you're funded, most funders now have the requirement that you have to share your data, make your data open, open data and open science. It might be to reduce. Data collection is very costly. It's very costly to collect data. And because of that, there's this increasing need to share data so that you don't double spend on collecting the same type of data. It might be because you're thinking about reproducibility. It might also be because you want to increase your citations, because when you put your data sets in a repository, it might increase your citations. Or simply because you think this is the right thing to do. There's an increasing, whatever reason, whatever motivation you have, there's an increasing need to share data. But another thing is that there are a number of barriers to data sharing. As the need to share data increases, the more we realize that there are more barriers to data sharing that we can actually think about. There are legal regulation or requirements that you need to consider, because if you don't consider them, you might not be able to share your data. The emergence of the GDPR, the European General Data Protection Regulation, and other data protection regulations around the world. In the US, you have HIPAA. In Canada, you have PIPEDA, and you have other types of data protection regulations emerging around the world. Actually, now we realize that there are regulatory requirements that we need to consider before we share our data. Yeah. I'm sharing my screen. Yeah. Sorry. Which one? This one?
Not that one. I think this one's going to.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that. Other barriers that we also need to consider can include ethical concerns. And one ethical concern is the risk of re-identifiability when you share human data. That is an ethical concern that can actually prevent you from sharing your data. Now I can't go to the, yes. Okay. But then there are also organizational barriers that you need to consider. A few months ago, after having such a presentation, a researcher came up to me and said, we have thousands and thousands of MRI data in our institution. We are ready to share it, but the top management can't allow us to share it. The reasons they can't give to the researchers. These are organizational barriers that can prevent you from sharing data. And then technical requirements. It might be because of lack of storage facility or infrastructure. It might be because of simply because you don't have the technical skills to actually share data. So these are barriers that, and there's also a wider sociocultural concern that we need to also consider. That means, as an individual researcher, you're considering a lot of things. You're considering funders' requirements. You're considering journal requirements. You're considering international regulations. You're also considering national laws and policies that you need to consider. There's a lot as an individual researcher you need to consider. But what will help you to freely and easily share your data will be, what if you have help? What if you have a harmonized way of understanding how to share data through data governance? And that's what data governance is about. So when you hear data governance, and I know you've heard about data governance in different fields, what do you think of data governance when you hear it? Because sometimes when I ask this question, I get a lot of reactions, different reactions. So what do you think data governance is? Yep. A lot of bureaucracy. That's an interesting one. Somebody was talking there. Rules and regulations. Any other person? These are absolutely valid perceptions of data governance, but they are not the only conception of data governance you should have. Data governance has been defined within neuroscience. Fortigal et al., one of my former colleagues, they had a paper out and they defined data governance as the overall management of the availability, of the usability, integrity, quality, and security of the data, in order to ensure that the potential of the data is maximized while you comply with regulatory and ethical principles. This is very important for each one of us, because what we want as researchers in neuroscience is to have data available, is to have usable data, not unstructured data, but usable data, data with integrity, data with sufficient quality that you can use for your analysis, and also the security of the data. But what this definition failed to do is to tell us what the data governance is about. The overall management is a bit vague. So in a recent paper that we published within the context of the IBI, we define data governance as those principles, the procedures that you develop, the organizational frameworks that you adopt, the policies that you establish within the organization to ensure the acceptable and responsible processing of data, very importantly, at each stage of the data lifecycle, from collection to storage, to processing, to curation, sharing, application, use, and deletion. It is not a one-stage process. Data governance is not a one-stage process. It's not something that you only consider when you want to share your data. It's not something that you only consider at the point of collection and forget it. It is a continuous process of reflection, of understanding how to responsibly share or collect and process the data in a way that is legally compliant, in a way that is ethically responsible, in a way that is socially acceptable. And that is what data governance is about. It is about the people, the processes, and the technologies that you develop or establish to provide an effective or functional data ecosystem or data processing ecosystem. And this not only benefits your research, it benefits the organization, and it also helps you to be compliant with regulations and ethical principles. Therefore, as you've pointed out earlier, it is not just about the rules and regulations. It's not just about data protection, which is about the rules, the legal provisions that can help you to protect personal data. It is not just about data management. These two elements are essential elements of data governance, but it is not just that. And also, it is not a got-here process, just a bureaucratic process. It is not just a got-here process. I need to see what you're doing. No. It is a responsible process of reflecting on your data processing activities in a way to ensure that it doesn't harm the data subjects, and it helps you to have data available, a usable data or set of data, and also data with quality, sufficient quality and integrity. So in the last few years, you may have heard about FAIR. To make your data findable, to make your data accessible, to make your data interpretable, to make your data reusable. And in neuroscience, it has gained well-accepted traction. We now think about a lot of technical processes, a lot of technical infrastructure to help make data fair. But FAIR only addresses one element of data governance, which is the technical elements of data governance. Data governance is not just about the technical requirements to make our data findable, to make our data accessible, to make our data interpretable, because there are other things that we need to consider to make the data fair, which is laws and ethics. So FAIR, as it is, does not really consider fair laws and ethics. And without laws and ethics, consideration of laws and ethics, all your technical or infrastructure, all the technical infrastructure that you develop might fail to make your data fair. Therefore, there is a need for what I call fair C, fair and compliance. We need to begin to consider compliance as an essential or critical element of fair. And when we mean compliance, what do we mean? Compliance to what? Compliance to ethical principles, compliance to technical requirements, which FAIR is already doing, compliance with legal provisions, compliance with societal expectations. These are very important to make our data fair. If, take for instance, you've developed a well-accepted metadata standard. You use that. You have a secure infrastructure to share your data. You have all the technical skills to make your data findable, accessible, interpretable, and reusable. But if you don't consider the ethical principles involved in data processing, if you don't consider the legal provisions within the data processing pipelines and workflows that you have, your data will not be fair. And that's very important. So fair C is something that we'll have to begin to consider. So when we mean technical requirements, these are things maybe you interact with within this week or next week: metadata standards, storage infrastructure, or cybersecurity. These are all technical elements of FAIR that we always hear about and think about and consider. But there are also the ethical considerations that we need to start thinking about. For instance, incidental findings. This is something that maybe you are all aware of or not. What do we mean by incidental findings? Anybody? Yep. Exactly. You were not looking for tumor, but all of a sudden, looking through the image that you have, you discover that the patient has tumor. What do you do with it? That is an ethical question, an ethical consideration that you need to have to share your data. To provide solution to that in a data governance framework, what you need to do, and this is exactly what I advise people to do, is to have an incidental findings protocol on how to address incidental findings when you see them. And there are different ways of addressing incidental findings. But the first thing that you need to consider is to maybe put it in your informed consent form. Ask the patients. Allow them to exercise their autonomy and make the decisions themselves if they can. If we discover any incidental findings, would you want to know? Sometimes patients will tell you, we don't want to know. I don't want to know. And that is their choice to make that decision. Sometimes they tell you, yes, I want to know. So you have a duty to give them the information when you see it, when you find it. So this is an ethical consideration that you need to have when you're processing data. Another one, which is a critical one also, animal welfare differences. There's element of sociocultural values that come into this. What is acceptable in terms of animal welfare in one region might not be acceptable in another region. And we have to respect people's values and societal interests and expectations. For instance, in Europe and in the US, it's a bit difficult to get labs these days who are using NHPs for research, non-human primates. But in Asia, that is well accepted. They are proud of it. The society accepts it, and that is fine. But there is an ethical question about, as a society, if you're living in a region where there's a regulation and there is an ethical or societal expectation that you don't use NHPs for research, is it ethically responsible to use data collected from another region where the regulations are loose and these processes are accepted by the society? There is no law at the moment preventing you from using such data, but it's an ethical question that you have to answer. It's a moral question that you have to answer. Is it morally acceptable to use data collected? You know that ethically you will not have collected in the region where you're living. And this data was collected in a different region. Is it morally acceptable to use such data? Let me give you an instance. In 2019, a group of researchers in Kunming, China, conducted the research, created a transgenic monkey with human gene. In 2019, it was the monkeys were not modeling any diseases. They were just created to study the process of human evolution or brain development. This, I've interviewed a lot of neuroscientists in Europe. This research would not have taken place in Europe. And I know maybe it may not have taken place in the US. When the publication came out in 2019, just note, there was no journal in Europe or in the West that accepted to publish this. So it was published in the National Research Review of China. I think I'm right in saying that. In the National Science Review of China. So when the publication came out, there were loads and loads of negative press. From ethically fraught experiment has produced monkeys with added human brain cells. Whether this is possible is something that I don't want us to begin to address, but the fact that such an experiment took place was a problem for a lot of people. A US researcher, Martin Steiner, was also part of the research team that published this. So when the negative press started coming in, he tried to disassociate himself from this research. And the quote below there was from him. There are a bunch of aspects of this study that you could not do in the US. And he basically disassociated himself from the research. So if you are working in the US, if you're working in Europe, where such a research experiment could not have taken place, what will be the moral answer, the moral question that you ask yourself, and what will be the answer? And this is something that we need to begin to consider in neuroscience. Yep. Yes. Sorry, I didn't hear. Okay, so he's asking what's the difference between the ethical and the moral distinction. Ethics is the study of moral standards. And moral standards are individual moral choices that you make. So in this instance, you have to make a moral judgment as a researcher. As I said, there is no regulation preventing you. There's no law preventing you from using such data. But it's the individual judgment that you make in this instance that is important. And also, if you're working within an organization, what will be the reputational damage that you will get from using such data? So there is the concern about reputational risk if you use such data. Yeah.
For example, most of the information about the radiological impact in radiology comes from what happened after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A lot of what we know about people's development comes from the Nazi camps, where they did unethical experiments on pregnant women. So this data is actually with us all the time. It is not realized.
You're right. You're absolutely right. And the Nazi experiment is an interesting one. Usually, that's the correlation that comes in here whenever this issue is discussed. But as it is now, maybe in the 70s, in the late 80s, but now there are movements, there are objections to using such data in science. So as I said, there is still not any law preventing you from using such data, but it's a moral question that you have to ask yourself. So, but aside from the technical and the ethical considerations, there's also the legal considerations, and which will be the central point of this discussion today. So, in considering laws in neuroscience data governance, there are a few things that we need to consider. I'm not going to talk about the divergent regulations or regulatory provisions available for us to consider, because there are lots of them. Which one do you want to consider? But I will base my analysis, or I will base my suggestions to you on the GDPR, on the EU General Data Protection Regulation. And that is the reason why it's obvious. For instance, in the US has a very fragmented data protection regulation ecosystem. There's HIPAA, but HIPAA is a sector-specific regulation. The different states also have their own data protection regulations. So the most robust, data protection regulation that is available for us is the GDPR, and that's why I'm basing it on GDPR. Yeah. 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 Yeah, that's an interesting one. But I don't usually want to stretch it of reading of the paper. If we stretch it to that level, there are nuanced issues on that. So what I'm thinking about when I say using the data is about using the data set, the MRI data or the raw data collected from the experiment. If there was an MRI, let's say an MRI image or whatever, right? Put in a repository somewhere. If I download that, if I go download that and use it, that is maybe a way of endorsing the research experiment that actually produced that. That's what I said earlier. I don't want to stretch it to citing. If yes, I completely understand. But as I said, I don't want to stretch it to that point because there are different things that would then begin to consider when we do that. So I will leave it to, if I've cited this paper. I've cited this paper in one of my recent papers, but I cited it as an example of a bad experiment. So that is not an endorsement of the experiment. So there are different issues that we discuss there when you go there, right? So I don't know whether that answered your question. Yes. Yes, the goal is to discourage such experiment that we consider unethical. So in considering the legal provisions, there are three things that you need to consider in addressing the legal concerns. One is identifying a legal basis for processing the data. A legal basis for processing the data. And this is about when the data involves living human beings, the processing of personally identifiable information. Identify legal basis for processing. Develop technical and organizational measures, which includes relevant agreements, but I'm going to talk about them in detail. But before we do that, what do we mean by personal data? So the GDPR applies to personal data. In the US, you call it PII, as personally identifiable information. And by processing, I mean any operation or a set of operations which are performed on the personal data. That's what I mean by processing. So collection is processing, sharing is processing, applying it is processing. So, and identifiable, when we mean identifiable, it means that if anyone can identify the natural person using all means reasonably likely to be used. All means reasonably likely to be used. This is very important. And the reason why I'm saying it's very important is we're going to come back to it when we discuss pseudonymization and anonymization. All means likely reasonably to be used. The reason why this is the case is all means reasonably likely to be used has what is called a test of re-identifiability to it. Considering time it will take to re-identify the individual, considering the cost of re-identifying the individual, and considering the availability of technologies to do that. So all means reasonably likely to be used is very important definition here. So, and by personal data, your names, telephone numbers, email addresses, identification numbers, account-related information, such as human resource data, location data, IP addresses, all these are called general personal data. But there's also another category of personal data that is very important. And this is called special category personal data. Any information revealing racial or ethnic origin. These are special because they are sensitive and they require more protection. Political opinions, any information revealing religious or philosophical beliefs, trade union membership, genetic data, but most importantly for us, any data concerning health. And for us as neuroscientists, we interact with a lot of data that we can consider the health data. And these are called special category data. And the difference here is the way you protect general personal data is not the same way you protect health data, which is a special category data. So the GDPR, from what we've just talked about, the GDPR includes pseudonymized data or de-identified data. Because pseudonymized data, there is still the possibility of re-identification. By pseudonymization, I mean removing the indirect, direct, some indirect or direct identifiers from the personal data. That's what pseudonymization means. And in the US, the HIPAA defined it as de-identified data. But for us, in the GDPR in Europe, they call it pseudonymized data. They are the same. Because there's a possibility of re-identifiability of the data subject, which is the individual. Once there is that possibility, considering the time it would take, considering the available technologies, and considering cost, then you find out that most of what we have are pseudonymized data, not anonymized data. For the past few years, we have now come to the knowledge to realize that most of what we used to call anonymized neuroimages are pseudonymized neuroimages. Because defacing techniques or other techniques, score stripping or face blurring techniques that we have do not remove everything. There are still brain prints, which are like fingerprints in the images, which can be used to re-identify the individual. And because of that, that is still considered personal data. That is still considered special category data. The reason why we used to term these data sets anonymized data before now was because if they are purely anonymized, they do not fall under the provisions of the regulation. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Damian, I just have a comment or question on that. I completely agree, and thank you for making this great summary. I work myself a lot with GDPR, so I completely agree. Maybe one comment to this is so that exactly the last point you're making is a little bit on the lawyer side, depending on which national lawyers you talk to, it's not clear, because as you have mentioned before, the legal term is by reasonable means necessary. So if it takes basically very specialized neuroimage research abilities in order to reface, and then from the face saying you don't have pseudonymized, but you have actually completely thrown all the keys you had and names away. Let's say you only have a defaced NIFTY and no other information available with the NIFTY file. Then the lawyers right now let you get away with calling this anonymized because you've thrown all keys away, because by reasonable means you would first have to reface, and then from the face you would have to be able to, from a Facebook photographs, identify the person. So I completely agree with you. But right now, the lawyers are also discussing with us technical people and saying, okay, what is reasonable means? Just as a comment, but thank you.
No, that's a very good comment. That's a very, very good comment. And this is a discussion that we've had in so many circles in Europe. But what you're saying is true, but the caveat there is availability of technology. Before now, there was no availability of technology to reface but now there's availability of technology. So if you do a real re-identifiability test, that will fail because there's availability of technology to do it, right? So, and that's why it's safe to consider such data sets as pseudonymized data so that you can protect them. It doesn't mean that you can't share them, because that's always the fear. The fear always is if they are personal data, if they are pseudonymized data, that means I can't share them. No, you can't. And I'm going to talk about it. So, and if it is post-mortem data, the regulation doesn't actually cover it. If it is animal data, as I said earlier, there's no regulation that covers that. But if it is a living human being and you're dealing with personally identifiable data, whether it's defaced or not, I think you need to develop technical and organizational measures. Yep. Yes, that's a very good question, actually. It's an ethical question. That's another issue that goes to ethics rather than the law. It's an ethical question rather than a legal solution. If you need to also consider the family and everything. In Europe, so many countries are coming up with laws now to cover that. But so far, there is no available evidence in law that GDPR or any data protection regulation that I know covers post-mortem data. But it's an ethical question that you also need to consider. So identifying legal basis for processing, what the GDPR call lawful basis for processing. The first thing that we do always as scientists is to go to consent. If I have consent, that means I can share. It's very important to note this. Consent as a lawful basis for processing is different from consent as a scientific protocol that you need to have with patients. It's completely different. There are thousands and thousands of data sets in silos today that are not shared simply because they do not have adequate consent from the data subjects to share them or to. So what I mean here is, in your consent form, you have to put a paragraph there asking the permission from the patients to use the data after research, to share the data. And that is the consent that can serve as a lawful basis for processing the data. But there are other lawful bases that you can also consider. Generally, there is contract processing for reasons of contract, for processing of for reasons for legal obligation as vital interest, for public tasks and legitimate interest. But the most important thing to note here is consent is not the only lawful basis for processing. That's the mistake researchers make. Consent is not the only lawful basis for processing. And this is Article 6. In Article 9, the GDPR has more lawful basis for processing. Explicit consent, and this is the one that actually confuses researchers the more. You have to be explicit on what you're going to use the research to do, what you're going to use the data to do. But that's very confusing for researchers. I can't be that explicit in research because there are different levels of application of data that I might not know today. Yeah. 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 That's very true. And the GDPR actually addressed that, but a lot of researchers don't know. Because if you check this Article 9, you can see that there is a lawful basis there called archiving purposes in public interest, scientific and historical research purposes or statistical purposes. That means you can identify that as your lawful basis. But just as the GDPR said, if it is special category data, you need at least one lawful basis from Article 9 and one lawful basis from Article 6. If in Article 6, you can see public task there, which is what we usually advise researchers to pick as the lawful basis. Necessary to perform a task in the public interest. Necessary to perform a task in the public interest. Research is in the public interest. You can choose this as your lawful basis for processing. In Europe, that's well accepted. You must not always have consent to process or to share the data. So you can actually, a lot of regulatory authorities are advising researchers never to use consent, and I will tell you why. never to use consent, because if you use consent as a lawful basis, there are other legal requirements that you need to consider. In North America, sorry, say that again. Yeah. Yes, that's true. That is a good distinction, a good point to make here. But when you're then working with EU researchers, or you want to make your data available through EU or European research infrastructures, you need to consider all this. And as I said earlier, the reason why I'm saying this is because most data protection regulations now are going to mirror the GDPR. And if we have an understanding of some of these points, it will be important for our research going forward. The reason why we don't usually advise researchers to choose consent is because when you do, you then have to consider almost all the data subject rights. The right to be informed always applies. That's fine. The right to have access always applies. The right to rectification always applies. But the other ones, the right to erasure, which is difficult in science. You can't have a data set of maybe 50 patients and 10 patients come to you, I needed to delete my data. It affects your analysis. So that's a problem in research. And that's why we don't usually advise researchers to choose consent, because there are other legitimate lawful bases that you can choose from. So this is the table by the ICO. If you use consent, you have to consider right to erasure. You have to consider right to portability, which is difficult in research to do. But if you use public task, you will not consider those. And that's helpful for your research. So another thing that you need to do is to create organizational safeguards. Understand the different agreements that you need to have. All these agreements will protect you and actually define your roles and responsibilities in the data processing pipeline. Data use agreements, data transfer agreements, data processing agreements, and joint controllership agreements. So all these can help you in understanding your responsibilities and also defining other people's roles in the data processing workflow so as to protect data subjects. But I don't think we have time to go through these individual agreements to understand what they mean and how to draft them. But another important thing that you need to consider in terms of providing solution to legal regulatory provisions is to establish technical measures. One is anonymization and pseudonymization. If you can anonymize, good luck to you. Good luck. But it's very hard to term any process these days foolproof in terms of anonymization. Because recent research and advanced technologies have shown that it's not practically impossible, but difficult. So if you're able to pseudonymize defacing, just note, defacing techniques do not give you full anonymization. They pseudonymize the data. And then you have to consider encryption, whether at rest or on transit. So these will help you to understand what to do in terms of regulatory provisions. There are things you need to understand. GDPR is not an excuse not to share data. Laws are not excuses not to share data. Consent for research protocol is different from consent as lawful basis. Very important. Consent is not the only lawful basis, and it's not usually, it's not the only lawful basis. It's not usually the right lawful basis. And always remember your duties to the data subject. As researchers, you have a duty of confidentiality to the data subject. You have a duty to facilitate the person's autonomy. You have a duty not to harm. You have a duty to actually help the data subject and not to harm them. So in summary, when you consider the laws that you need to look at, know these 3 points. Identify lawful basis for processing. Create organizational safeguards and establish technical measures. Once you do that, you can responsibly share and process the data in neuroscience. But that's too much to ask for an individual researcher, is it not? To consider all these regulatory provisions, to consider the technical requirements, to consider some of the ethical principles that you need to adhere to. That's too much to ask from an individual researcher. Most often, our institutions do not help us. They do not have dedicated individuals to guide us through. As researchers, we want to just carry on with the business of doing research, not to consider laws and regulations. Often, that's not what we want to do. And that is why research infrastructures and repositories have a role to play here. Because most often, that's where our data sets end up. They have a role to play here. And that is why I introduce you to eBrains, a research infrastructure developed from the EU Human Brain Project. So what does eBrain do? eBrain is a research infrastructure that has already built in FAIR-C processes, FAIR-C framework within our system to help you in the process of identifying lawful basis, in the process of considering the technical measures or establishing the organizational safeguards that you need. We have different services in eBrains. A data and knowledge service where you can store your data to make it findable. All types of data sets. We also have an Atlas service with an Atlas viewer where you can actually view your data sets in the Atlas viewer service. And then if you want to use your data sets for some simulation, we have all sorts of simulation services. From neurorobotic services to so many simulation services, to neuromorphic simulation services. And then we have also brain-inspired technologies that you can use with your data. And if you don't want to use your own data sets, we also have a repository of data sets from around the world where you can come and use the data sets. But you will not be required to consider all these processes, the legal, ethical, technological, or requirements, because we have a dedicated team that will help you through the process. There are also different other repositories around the world. But I doubt they might be doing the same thing that we're doing in terms of considering FAIR-C. As an individual researcher, you need to understand some of the points I've made here today in terms of considering the ethical concerns, in terms of considering the technical requirements, and also the legal provisions that will help you to be responsible in your data processing activities. So what you get in eBrains is a research infrastructure that balances FAIR requirements with compliance to ethical and legal provisions and principles. A curation process that supports you with technical requirements as well as with organizational safeguards. And also provides you with different consent and agreement templates in the process. So to give you a picture of how how we consider this issue of anonymization and pseudonymization in e-brains is, if it is raw data, everything intact, the indirect identifiers, the direct identifiers, we do not touch it. That's a no-no. We do not touch it. If you have eliminated some of the direct identifiers, but there is still some indirect identifiers partially intact in terms of brain prints, we accept them, but they will go to what we call data or service for sensitive data. Now, if it is pseudonymized data, what we call maybe strongly pseudonymized data, if the pseudonymization technique, this defacing technique is strong enough, they go through our system, but they will be shared through what we call the HDG, the Human Data Gateway. For the Human Data Gateway, for you to access the data there, you have to sign a data use agreement. You have to sign a data processing agreement. We have to know who you are. You have to go through our access control mechanism to understand who you are. And we know how to contact you if there's any breach. And that is a way of making the data fair, but not open access. Because fair findability and accessibility does not often mean open access, fully open access. It can also be controlled access. And then if it is anonymous statistics, if it is animal data, if it is post-mortem data, we accept it and it's shared freely on the platform. So I don't know how much time we've got. How much time? Half an hour, yeah. Okay, that was right on point. I wanted us to discuss a case study. I don't know how we're going to do it. Maybe in 3 groups, or for those in the room, 3 groups, or looking at the number here, maybe 10 each or more than 10. Is that okay? Yeah, it's just to read through the case study and then identify the technical, ethical, and legal requirements the researchers need to consider in terms of sharing the data. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Similar to, let's say, that when you do something, your employer knows your ethnicity, knows your gender, all of these sensitive data, but it is illegal for your employer to discriminate based on that. So wouldn't it also be useful to have use of identifiable data? Let's say by college girls, when they get access to neuroscientific data, they know you're likely to develop a brain tumor rate and to then have the legal requirements or like regarding on maybe in addition to regarding the research the social technical regulations mechanism, but also then having the legal guards in place that would prosecute and forbid this abuse of the data as an addition.
This is a very interesting point. One of my colleagues, Brent Middlestad in Oxford, actually that's what he works on. And in Europe, that's easy because companies are not allowed to discriminate against you based on automated decision made from the data, which is exactly what you're talking about in terms of insurance companies. In the US, it's a bit difficult. It's a different ecosystem in the US because of, as I said earlier on, the fragmented nature of the data protection laws in the US. But in Europe, yes, what you're saying is already in place. There are case laws actually to prove that. It's already in place that no company would discriminate against you based on an automated decision made from the data you've provided. If they do, you have the right to sue them or complain to the Data Protection Authority. But in the US, that's a bit difficult. That's a bit difficult because there's no central data protection authority in the US for such cases. But I know in Europe, it's been addressed. I don't know whether that answered the question. Okay. Okay. So are we ready with? Okay. Okay.
Okay, Zoom people, I hope you can hear me. Great. So we're going to put you into breakout rooms if you're on Zoom. For everyone in person, you'll split up into 5 groups, I think, and just go to one of the different rooms. So there's Alder 103. One of you can stay here. There's 3 classrooms just kind of back this way. So you can split into your own groups. Zoom people, you'll be randomly assigned online. And the case study is at the very top of the Slack channel for Damian's talk. So in the Slack channel, Eke dash, I forget what the governance, Eke dash governance, you can find the case study. So Zoom people will split you up in just a second.
Yeah, let's do that. Maybe 15 minutes of discussion. Select one person from each group to give us a summary of what you've discussed. Is that fair? 15 minutes chat? Okay. Now I'm going to pass the microphone to the people you have appointed to summarize your discussions. The point of this case study is not to assess your full knowledge of what we have discussed today, but at least is to help you to start thinking about some of the practical aspects of what you might encounter in terms of your data processing workflows in your individual research labs and also in your collaborations. So I don't know where we'll start with with online. Yeah.
Groups on Zoom, there were 2 of you. Would one of you like to volunteer to go first? Or would someone else here like to volunteer to go first?
I don't know if any of us in our group set up somebody to volunteer to speak. So
Okay.
sorry about that.
So are you volunteering?
Do you want to volunteer? Jennifer?
Yeah, I mean, I can. I don't know how well I'll cover everything, but I'll do my best.
Okay, go on then.
Yeah, so I'm from the US and I had a discussion with some people from Europe about this, which was really interesting. And obviously I don't work in animal research, but I went into the discussion thinking that the main issue would be the human research side of things. But obviously we talked a lot about sharing across continents and how this might work, the legal requirements, and how this would probably not even happen at all for the animal research if it was done externally. They can't conduct any sort of primate research at all in most of Europe. So there was that restriction. And yeah, so that's primarily what we talked about in our group, just the legal side of
Okay.
that.
Okay. The second group. Anybody from the second group online?
We also talked about the legal and also ethical implications of using the non-human primates for the US-based researchers. Talked about in terms of technical requirements, making sure that the human neuroimage data was defaced, but we're having sort of like a hard time thinking about other technical issues to consider for the non-human animals. But everything else, I think Jennifer had covered.
Okay. That's fine. Okay.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Go on then.
Okay, great. Is this coming through? Okay, great. So for our group, for an ethical concern, we talked about how it wasn't really made explicit whether or not the non-human primate and living human research would be predicated on the mice research being successful. You can imagine that if you get a null result in mice, then it might not even be worth spending all this money and potential risk in working with non-human primates and humans. We also mentioned that we should probably go by this there might be different IRBs in these institutions, and that you're gonna have to go to the lowest common denominator, or like the strictest IRB, just to make sure that kind of like all rules are being followed at all places. For legal, we talked about how I think someone already mentioned data sharing is going to be different across all these nations. And then de-identifying data. And then for the technical, we thought that it might be particularly hard to make these transgenic non-human primates, because that usually involves breeding, and the maturity life cycle is much quicker in mice than it is with non-human primates. And then recruiting humans is always difficult, especially when involves a lot of big words like transgenic and cytochrome.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. This was a very good one. I didn't consider the scientific implications to this, but I think you have pointed out about 2 or 3 scientific implications of this, which is important, and also which points to the ethical principle of data minimization, whether it is actually necessary to go for the transgenic non-human primate data. But the clear information there is that they also considering using data they didn't collect, but the data was collected in China. So that's an important point.
Yeah, so that was actually one thing we thought about, is how was the data being collected from China, and whether that was being collected ethically, following any kind of like IACUC like similar. I know US has IACUC. I don't know what it is anywhere else, but were those animals, ethically treated while that data was being collected? So some technical things. I think one thing we talked about was the transgene being used, whether that was a direct like human transgene, so human into mice, human into non-human primates. And then we consider, you want to consider how is the data going to be anonymized for each thing. So for mice, I don't think you need to do it, but I couldn't remember that. So then there's also non-human primates and how to go about anonymizing that data, as well as the human data as well. And then especially considering you're getting it from different places and you're sharing it around, you definitely want to make sure you're considering that. The other is, how is that data being stored? I guess because this is what a US project with EU and non-EU partners, how is that being stored across people? How is it being, is it going to be accessible, or is it stuck on one person's server? Can it be, you know, reused later on? Things like that. The others, we thought about like legal justification as to, you know, why are they doing this? Like, was it because, are you getting this human data just because humans were like, yeah, sure, take my brain stuff, do whatever you want? Or are you doing this for a real purpose, to further research? And I think, yeah, so just, yeah, I think that's kind of it, like the ethical stuff. Do the standards match around for all the partners or everyone involved in this? And is the data being collected in an ethical manner, especially when you're working with humans? You want to make sure, you know, you're collecting that ethically as well.
Thank you. An important point to make is that animals, whether mice or non-human primates, do not have the same privacy concerns that we have. So anonymization and pseudonymization, it's totally out of the question for whatever can you pass the microphone?
Who am I passing this to? Someone down here?
Hi, everyone. We didn't take notes, so I'm going to do this purely based off memory. We've talked about a lot of the things that the other groups talked about, sort of how is the US versus the other countries involved harmonizing like their IRB protocols. We also talked about when they state that this will be applicable to humans, like, is there a certain population that they're trying to like make sure that this result is applicable in? We also sort of talked about the ethical concerns of like what's happening to these mice and non-human primates after this. And then ultimately we were really confused and wondering what is the research question for this study and what are their goals? Because there seems to be like a lot going on here.
Yes. So you're right. Considering the regulatory differences is quite an important point. Yeah. In the last group, who's going? Is it me or you?
I think we talked most everybody said what we were talking about, but one of the things that we should stress is that we don't actually know if the non-human primates would we have the same like behavioral and brain morphology differences as it was described for the mice. So there's like ethical concerns that we should consider when conducting experiments with non-human primates. And yeah, and like we also said that as we are talking about like a multi-center studies, there should be like a data sharing agreement among those institutions. So we can like have we can check among them if they were like the data, and we could have like a double check. And what else, guys? I don't remember everything. We talked too much.
Disease they're actually trying to treat, like with the living humans, is there like a natural genetic variant that is called brain morphology? Because I know cytochrome P450 is involved in metabolism, but
Thank you very much. I love this case study. I must tell you this. This is not the first time I'm using it, and the trend hasn't changed. Anytime a group of neuroscientists discuss this case study, the first thing they do is to go to the scientific implications, the science, because that's what you do. That's what you're trained to do. You go to the science by instinct, by training. But the case of the point of the case study is to other things rather than science, other things apart from science. That's the key. The trend hasn't changed. So don't be, I'm not surprised that that was the case here, because that's what you're trained to do. But the point of this is to help you to start thinking about other things. What are the ethical implications or considerations that I need to have here? The legal implications. The first thing that you will notice is loads of jurisdictions involved. Europe, non-Europe, non-EU, the US, China, loads of jurisdictions. Can you first of all map how this data is going, where they are generated, and where they are going to be stored? That's the first thing you do. And then you consider the sociocultural differences involved, the values that you need to consider, the regulations that you need to consider. That's the second stage. And then you begin to address some of the points, the ethical concerns, the legal concerns, because you have to be fair to each jurisdiction. And that's the complexity of an international research. You have to be fair to each jurisdiction. You consider European regulations, European values or societal expectations, non-EU values and societal expectations, the US values and societal expectations. But also, remember, the data is going to end up in e-brains. The data sets are going to end up in e-brains. Although you have considered maybe the US regulations, have you considered some of the regulatory provisions that you need to think about when you're putting your data set in an European research infrastructure? So there's a bunch of complex activities or things that you need to think about here. And that's the point of this case study. As a neuroscientist, when you're faced with these things, the science, yes, but then the sociocultural, ethical, and legal points should be at the forefront of your mind. And if you're dealing with animal data, you handle that differently. If you're dealing with human data, you handle that differently. But being fair, being culturally sensitive, being ethically responsible, legally compliant, and socially acceptable in your ways. Thank you very much.